by the City of Vancouver, and indeed they were heard. I followed up on that promise by delivering the report to them. Secondly, to really have a clear and compelling question. Make it very specific what you're asking people to do. And it's the same thing for anything online, is that, you know, what is the one thing you're asking people to do, and make that simple to understand. Number 3, we've talked about a number of times, make it easy to participate at all levels of skill, time, and interest. Number 4, find and encourage early adopters. One of the things I didn't mention, but for each of the discussion groups, I identified 3 people I knew, either personally or through the community, and said, would you mind showing up as soon as it goes live and posting a response to your question? So that when others showed up who were kind of like, what is this thing? They didn't see an echo chamber. Instead, they saw other people participating, they were able to follow that. And then lastly, this idea about really thinking through how do we learn and how do we get better at it over time. So this is me. I hope that some of this stuff was useful to you, and I'd love to hear any questions or comments that people might have.
So they made an app for this thing, right?
Yes.
What was that process like? Was making an app, do you gotta be pretty techy, or can you click and drag, okay, I want a chat box? Like, what was that kind of process to make an app for Facebook to do this?
It was a tech firm I hired to do it. It's based out of Washington, D.C. Their name is Fission, Fission Strategies, I think. And they're really good at doing online engagement, and they were friends of mine. They gave me a cut rate. But, you know, it's intensive. And so the benefit of having an app is that we were able to have exactly the functionality we wanted and the look and feel that we wanted. On the other hand, it didn't integrate into Facebook. And so we had these problems where we couldn't actually update in people's timelines to say this was what was happening in the discussion group. And that was partly by design. Take care. Thanks. Anyway, there was all sorts of trade-offs there. But yeah, there was an app. Yeah.
Just to finish off that comment, actually, I had a question about that too. So what do you mean integrate or not integrate?
Right.
I thought that's the whole point of an app, is it is integrated.
So because this was a UBC study, and up until the time I did this, they'd never authorized a Facebook study in the entire university. And so I was like, wow, I'm going to need to be very, very cautious here. And so in being cautious, what I said was, in the small group discussions, because people are trying on ideas and they're talking with one another, this will be a private affair, where just like a group, it doesn't show up in your timeline. Or actually, no, that's not true. A group would, yeah. So I even made it more private than a group, hoping that it would get passed by ethics, and they passed it without asking any questions. And that's when I knew I'd made a mistake. Yeah. So if I was doing it for a non-university audience, I would certainly have done it differently. But so what happened was then, it was integrated in the sense that the public phase showed up in people's feeds, and people were able to share it on each other's walls, and that actually had really nice momentum. But the discussion itself for the 2.5 weeks, you had to go to the app to find out what was going on, and that was a real limitation. Yeah, Eli.
Sure. So, as you said, so say I don't have a developer in my back pocket.
Yeah.
Do you think that using the standard Facebook experience, that enough of this, what we could, another group could recreate what you guys created there? Like, what is the core element and what's like the gravy?
Yeah. So for me, I really wanted to be able to move people through different deliberative exercises. And I think you could do that just as well on a fan page or a group page. There are trade-offs on both sides. But I think that for a cost-effective approach, you can apply the basic principle of let's have a clear question and a real opportunity to do something together and invite people to participate and use the tools that Facebook has and still be quite effective. That's my sense of it.
Right. Would it be, you think, very important to have their email address at some point, just to have the knock them over the head, like let's go back, like that reminder, since they can sometimes you can get lost within the Facebook wall?
So that's what I thought, and I actually did. So I set it up that the primary mechanism for reminding people to participate was through email. Now I had everybody's email address, and I added them through. I use a bulk emailer called MailChimp, and I was sending them messages through MailChimp. But because they actually hadn't signed up through MailChimp, it wasn't delivering to people's inboxes, it was going to spam. Like an enormously high percentage of people were getting it into their spam boxes. I worked in MailChimp for like 3 days trying to figure out a way around this. And so we came up with all sorts of solutions. I sent an email to everybody who hadn't opened a message up until that point, asking them to add us to their safe senders list. The facilitators took their group bit by bit and Facebook messaged each one of them. But if you Facebook message too many people in a short amount of time that you're not friends with, Facebook will respond and say, are you a spammer? Because we don't like spammers, and we're threatening to shut down your account. And so then the facilitators were worried, and they said, oh, what do we do? And so we did all sorts of techniques to try to get around it. So the message is that Facebook is the most reliable way to get in touch with them, and there needs to be a better way to do the kind of the sign up. Maybe in the kind of joining the event, you might have a pop-up page that gets people to sign up for the email delivery, right into the tool. I'm not sure. It was horrific. I was like pulling my hair out. Yeah.
What about other academic institutions? Have they done projects like you've done, or are you world setter here?
So in terms of doing this kind of a dialogue, it's in Facebook. It was the first time it's been done that I know. But people are using Facebook in all sorts of different ways. And actually, Eric, you might want to talk a little bit about the work you're planning to do.
Yeah, and I lied when I said Maida wasn't coming. She's right back there.
I don't have my glasses on. I was like, is that
She's in
Maida?
the back.
I don't know, because he told me she
to
wasn't
Gary.
coming, so
I know.
I don't want to ask her. This is another one of our facilitators. So, Eric, let's hear from you, and then Maida, I'd love to get some of your reactions and ideas about the event.
What would you like to hear about?
So how are you using Facebook to engage people?
Holy moly. Well, Maida and I are both working on a project that is actually part of the project, and I'll just talk about that component, was to develop an app with Facebook as well. And we use a developer on campus at UBC because we're also doing research at UBC. And a lot of what Susanna said is still very true. Connecting an application to Facebook is very challenging. Facebook has a lot of privacy issues, and they're very central. So connecting an application to get people engaged in our research was a great challenge. And so we've had to develop, or the developers had to develop tools, sort of loophole ways to get people to be able to share that information that is in the application and transfer it over to the news feeds that are on Facebook that will actually share it with their networks. So that was a particular challenge.
Is it just briefly, what's the project you're working on?
Oh, sorry, I should probably explain that whole component. So we're basically doing an energy saving competition at 7 universities in BC. So we're engaging freshman residence houses. We've grouped them into groups, and they're actually all competing not only to save energy at the meter, which is red throughout this competition. They're now engaging in a participation component where they get points through this application in Facebook, and it can actually win individually and through a residence group level. So they're participating in these different challenges that we've developed along with this application developer to be able to do various different kinds of participation. And it hits on this mobilization levels of participation, whereby people can send letters to politicians, and it's identified who their MLA is through the application, through geolocation, or they can attend an event and they can get more points for that. Or they can actually self-report points by doing something daily and just clicking on scroll logs and actually submitting their own points. So there's trust-based there. And then the fourth one is actually vlogging, which we're super excited about. And that's actually getting people to get on cameras using flip cams and record themselves and do meaningful reflection, hopefully do meaningful reflection about behavior change and why they're doing energy saving, and post it onto Facebook. Because you can't post it into the application, but post it onto Facebook, and we're actually doing VJ-style adjudications and stuff. So there's tons of different ways that I'm learning about that you can engage people, and also tons of ways that you can get them to message back and reflect back, and each one is sort of along that gradient that you were talking about.
Great.
Which is fantastic.
Yeah, so doing this very innovative real-world actions, but using Facebook as the hub that they engage through. Maida, do you want to give any reflections on your experience being a facilitator, or any thoughts you might have about doing this kind of engaging the public in Facebook?
I think one of the key parts for develop relationships with each other as a facilitator was certainly challenging because they weren't part of each other's social networks originally. So really trying to draw parallels between like the points that they heard and getting them to engage with each other seemed to be, a lot of it was like the same things that you do in facilitation in real life, which is making sure that they hear each other, that they respond to each other as much as they're responding to their own experience. And I was thinking about the kinds of, I forget the chart that you had up, but certainly in terms of who was more likely to come back and have a conversation with each other, I felt like women were more likely to come back and have a conversation with each other, whereas men would often come, and I typically don't like generalizing things based on gender, but it was a little surprising for me. I was like, oh, I'm getting a monologue from the men and a dialogue from the women, and we're going there. But especially just emailing them and saying, I really appreciate this point. I would really like for you to come back to the conversation this next phase individually was what brought people back.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting thing about kind of that we brought people together to participate in something that they didn't know each other. They weren't even in each other's social networks. And beyond that, I put people into groups particularly for diversity. So that, I asked people, how do you commute to work or school or whatever you do? And then I put people into the groups in a way that had as many car drivers as possible in each group, and so that there was actually a chance to be able to learn from each other's differences, which is totally not why people use social media. And when I asked them, why do you use social media, the 3 top reasons are to stay in touch with people I see regularly, stay in touch with people I don't see regularly, and to find out about social events in my community. And so we're actually kind of like really pushing against some of the boundaries there.
Stirring the pot a bit.
Stirring the pot a little bit. But that's what democracy is, right? We need to be able to hear from each other and hear each other's differences. Because of course I'm going to say, as a bike rider, tons more bike lanes, but unless I start hearing from people who drive their cars every day who say, I can't take my kid's hockey stuff on a bike lane, and so, all right, maybe I should recommend a policy that makes space for everybody. So that was really the intention of trying it out. Maybe there's time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions if anybody has. Maida, yeah.
I guess my big question is in terms of working with cities to figure out what kinds of consultation they feel like they can actually use. What makes a consultation more likely for a government to respond to? So that if the people who engage opened up that document and were like, oh, I actually see what I suggested reflected in some way, what's that process like?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. So in my experience in both online and offline, engagement is really up front, sitting down with the city or the decision maker or the organization, asking what's on the table for you and what's off the table, what's already been decided and what's still up for grabs, and then helping the decision makers identify where would public input or stakeholder or staff input really help you figure out the way forward. Where are the places that you're not sure what the best thing to do is, to kind of have that kind of a scoping conversation, and then to frame the invitation within that scoping conversation. Now in some ways it's a very top-down approach because, for example, some work I did in California around healthcare reform, we had a statewide conversation, 4,000 people meeting in 8 different locations, face-to-face, to talk about healthcare reform. And the topics were the various reform legislations in the legislature at the time, which did not include universal health care or the system that Canada has. And a lot of people had come out, particularly because they want to see universal health care, and they were like so angry because they wanted to talk about it. And it was on the agenda, but it was a small part of the day. And there was legislators in the room, Schwarzenegger was there, Nunez was there, and they were getting a lot of pushback and kind of saying, we want to be able to talk about this. And so there was this tension of, if we talked about universal health care, there wouldn't be much possible in terms of action to happen because those were not the proposed bills that were alive at the time. There had been one, but it got killed. On the other hand, if we don't talk about that, then people are going to feel like it's not their process. And so it's a delicate balancing act of really creating a frame that's set up for responsiveness while being flexible enough in the implementation that you can change. So in the example of California, we ended up dropping one of the conversations that was sort of we felt like maybe wasn't as essential, and expanding the amount of time to talk about universal health care so that people really could give that message. And so in all the different processes, to both have that balance of responsiveness and strong framing, I think is pretty essential. Eric?
If you just scan back in your presentation, there was a graph that showed the ages of the people.
Yeah.
That was pretty compelling. Yeah, so I was really interested in a couple things. One is more sort of academic, and it relates to the demographics. I'm really curious why it's 0 to 24, because that clumps a couple of age groups that I think are probably would be very talking about levels of engagement, particularly youth, and different ways that we think about what youth means. But I'm curious about that, particularly because I was wondering if you looked more closely at that particular demographic and the ways that they might have engaged in your research.
Yeah. And this is actually, I guess, an old version of the slides. In my newer versions, I do 19 to 24, because that's more appropriate, because you're not going to have kids who are 10 involved in this kind of a thing.
I'm thinking of UBC or context, and you get an age group of, let's say, 18 to 25.
Yeah.
Now I'm actually displacing myself, but 18 to 25 is kind of that, sort of, I'm just being introduced to this and this world of opportunity, this world of choices, and I'm now starting to engage with all these things that I maybe didn't engage with before, and that's an assumption, but I'm just curious if you sort of looked at that more closely.
Are you asking? Sorry, can you ask the question?
I guess I'm
again?
just curious if you looked at youth particularly in that research.
I didn't focus on youth particularly, partially because it was my assumption that younger folks are going to be less interested in the deep policy conversations. Meaning that, so around that, I didn't, people to participate, you need to be 19 or older. So that age group I didn't include. But in terms of like breaking down 19 to the 30 category and what the differences were there, I didn't. And as you can see, primarily the biggest group we had was 25 to 34.
No, I think that's actually really wise though to think really about well, who are this audience I'm working with. So I did a survey at the David Suzuki Foundation, and my average age of survey respondents was 65. So when my thing capped out at 65 plus, that wasn't really that helpful. So that was a bit of a case where we really erred on the wrong side, but very similarly. This was a paper survey. So yeah, totally it's not this, it's self-selection bias in a different kind of way.
Through direct mail.
Yes. But it was still kind of oh, maybe we should have more gradients above 65 because oops.
Yeah. And actually, for this particular research, I do have gradients on both sides, but I just clump them together to make it easier to see.
But I totally think when we talk about talking to decision makers, that is such a powerful slide. I'm with you.
And when the City Council looked at this report during the presentation on the transportation stuff, they loved the gender piece. And I mean, it's a small sample, so we can't take it too far, but it spoke a lot to them about, isn't that interesting? And actually, Facebook users are more female than the average demographic trend in most countries. So,
Susanna, one question about, just in terms of where this is going, the big picture.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of what we've seen is this enablement of a two-way conversation dialogue in society where governments and the populations are able to communicate. And I think the communities are trying to get more involved on that spectrum of being able to influence how their community evolves. There's all sorts of different concepts of democracies, right? Direct democracies where everything's being decided on by communities. But, I guess just opening it up for a general discussion in terms of how you see us progressing. Do you see us, only a fraction of the way of where we're going to go in, say, the next 20 years? Or did you see that the City of Vancouver was responsive to this whole thing other than just the analytics and starting to act on it? I mean, one of the things I see is they're talking about taking down the viaducts. We go into the city and spending $500,000 on that, and that project is underway now. Well, for those of us who do commute, it's are you serious? How did that even become a topic? And so, on one hand, you see this great enabler of social media to create the dialogue and to influence, but you also see a construction of from the past that may not be receptive to it. So I'm very curious about your thoughts and your experience working sort of as a facilitator between all these areas.
Yeah, what I hear in that question is the question of, can institutions catch up with what society wants and how society is interacting with each other? Because you have these monoliths of organizations that have these deep levels of bureaucracy, and also, we see the dynamic of power relations, that as people take power, they become less and less aware or able to relate to the average citizen. And that even happens with groups of citizens that are brought together to work on an issue. They become less and less like the general public as well. So, but I think the big question is around institutional change and really thinking about the dynamics behind an organization. And how do we help organizations be more nimble and utilize the thinking that's behind Gov 2.0, which is kind of, we have all this technology, we have all these people, and silos are no longer serving us. So how do we actually be more nimble and responsive? And I think that there are three ways in which that happens. One is through crisis, where an organization really comes to the brink and they say, wow, we've got to do things differently. Nike is a very good example of that. Back in the WTO protest era, they were really under fire in a heavy way. And they vastly changed their purchasing and operations and labor standards. And so crisis is one way to change a large organization. Another is to have a very inspired leader, a champion who kind of gets it, who understands, hey, this really makes a difference, and to be able to push that through from the top of an organization. And then I think what we're also seeing is the kind of ground up way where 4 or 5 years ago, maybe not even that long, 4 years ago, social media was kind of like, it was in the IT department of most organizations. It was kind of the geeky sort of people who are like, we should try out this cool different stuff. And now it's actually, there's people in all departments who are starting to say, hey, I use this at home, why shouldn't we be using it at work? And starting to embed and actually change the way the different departments are working and pushing from the bottom up. And so I think with those kind of three things in place, because we are certainly facing crisis on lots of levels, and there are people who have seen kind of what's possible, I think that's kind of how change might happen. But we need to be, pretty clear on the kind of government we want, and and the kind of organizations we want, and then also to be able to be willing to build institutions outside of those formal structures where necessary. Yeah, it's an interesting question, though. Yeah. So I don't know, Eli. Do we have time for more, or should we
could do about 5 more minutes for sure. Then we'll wrap it up, send you guys home, and you guys can see your loved ones. It'll be great.
Beta, yeah.
Sorry to throw a hard one at the very end. In terms of making sure that public engagement is as inclusive as possible, over the next 5 years, how do you see helping English as a second language populations access such a text-based, English-based engagement strategy?
Yeah. I just saw there's real-time translation for government websites that Facebook is now offering. And it was a U.S. announcement, so I don't know if that's for all governments, but they're offering this real-time translation, I guess some sort of thing like Google Translate mechanism, but for Facebook, and particularly that's important in the U.S. around French, but in Canada for so many different languages. That's one way to do it, and I think the challenge there is twofold. One is how to make threefold. It's how to make space for people who speak a different language to participate in a text-based piece that's mostly English. So maybe this translation tool will address it. Secondly, how do we ensure that people who speak one language are not just speaking to each other, but actually speaking across languages? Because it's actually really important for us to know what the Chinese-speaking community or Mandarin-speaking community thinks about these issues. In Vancouver, where there's 25% of the population speaks Mandarin or Cantonese. So how do we mix those groups? And then thirdly, how do we be culturally relevant? And on that note, I'll say that UBC is having a panel on Thursday at 5 p.m. in the Irving K. Barber Learning Center about diversity, environmentalism, and social mobilization. And they have some really neat speakers. The woman behind Sharp Truth is going to be there. A reporter from one of the ethnic newspapers, I can't remember which one. Anyway, people are starting to think about it, but sort of that sort of culturally relevant, talking across language, and then making it relevant that way. It's a good question.
What is actually that UBC thing? Because actually, Joe Sullivan, who started this Net Tuesday, now is the social media guy for 350.org, is there part of the Friday morning. I think he's got a panel at 10 o'clock.
Yep, that's SIRS, the SIRS opening, and they're going to be talking for 3 days about this kind of stuff. about social mobilization, more sustainable societies, and there's going to be a stream about social media. Yeah. CIRS. If anybody wants to look it up.
What's a really cool and ideal feature that would make Facebook even better for public engagement that you thought about maybe?
Yeah, I think for me, kind of building on what Maida said, I've been thinking about for a while, is how to move away from text-based stuff. So it's cool that you guys are playing with the vlog idea, people doing video, but also just to tap into kind of our more creative selves as well. Like, can we do collaborative visual stuff as well as just talking? And so I think that the games feature kind of starts to feed into that. I just recently looked at this recycling game that where you like go and you clean up little garbage piles and stuff like that, and then you can bring your friends into it. And of course, you can buy stuff for money in Facebook. And so, but I think that's kind of the next thing, is really thinking through. So we've got relationships. That's what Facebook does so well, and that's why it's so powerful. We've got linking in non-linear ways. And then I guess now the next piece is, can we move away from just text and tap into our other modes of communicating? How about others? Anybody else have any things that they're kind of, wouldn't it be cool if?
I want to get rid of the stuff that drives me crazy, which is, I say yes to a lot of people on Facebook, but I actually, in the end of the day, only care about this core group, and I wish that I could hide people permanently. And I don't know you dearly, but I really actually want to see what my sisters are up to. And the rest of the world drowns it out sometimes on Facebook. I've polluted it by allowing, I think, too much into it.
And have you done show or not show?
Totally, and that holds for about 3 to 6 months or something. Eventually, it seems to forget this stuff.
So they change it now, subscribe, right? So you'll subscribe, and then it'll be like super friends. So they'll keep changing it, right? Moving targets.
Yeah.
So sorry, I was just gonna say. So Google Plus has coded that in. So have you experimented with Google Plus?
So 2 days ago.
Okay. So, and I don't use it at all, but I experimented, and I found out shockingly, like to my disgust, that they've basically recreated high school niches in Google Plus. You can create, they literally call them circles. You can create social circles in Google Plus. They can do exactly what you're asking. You can create communities, nodes of communities, and you can give them privileges to your information. You can grant them access to particular parts of your information that you choose to post. And so effectively you can hide people, but you can be acquainted. It's a very, very bizarre
It's very much like
perversion of like this, the way that Facebook is opening things up. It's also, I mean, it's not necessarily only bad. It just kind of freaked me out when I saw it, because I thought right away this is a way of marginalizing people. So, but I suppose it could work the other way too. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd start building your network from scratch again, or you can export Facebook.
No, it's brand new.
Yeah, it's a brand new network.
I'm sure there's, import your Gmail contact into Google Plus, right?
It is absolutely.
Yeah.
It's fully integrated. Yeah.
And I'd say actually Google Plus, in that, it has its dark side, as you were talking about, like the separation, but one of the things that people struggle with online is that we have multiple identities. So